On behalf of the Seminary and Third Age Planning Team and the Effective Living Centre, I welcome you. On behalf of the Seminary and the Third Age Planning Team and the Effective Living Centre, I welcome you all to the last presentation of the October series on the theme of relationship between faith and global concerns. And a special welcome if this is the first time for your tasting what the Seminary has to offer. I know you won't be disappointed. After Helen, and I'll introduce her in a moment, after her presentation, you're invited to stay behind for a bit of tea and coffee. Now, the usual housekeeping things. Toilets in the front of the church with the entrance there, but there's also a larger one down the aisle. Exits are the front doors or where the other exit signs are. And it's always good to check that mobiles are really turned off or on silent. Tonight we acknowledge the Kaurna Nation of the Adelaide, that is what we now call the Kaurna Plains, who've cared for this country for countless generations, land whose sovereignty has never been ceded. We pay our respects to their elders, desiring to learn all we can from them as they and all other Indigenous people in Australia seek to overcome what we now call a vox nullius. You've heard of terra nullius, empty land, vox nullius, by at last having a voice to Parliament, to be followed by a Makarrata process to facilitate treaty making and necessary truth telling. It's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Helen Phillips, who is our presenter for tonight. I was privileged to get to know Helen when she was a coordinator and mentor to the full-time lay education students we had back in the days of the Lay Education Centre on these adjacent premises, a role which enabled us to appreciate her good sense, sensitive pastoral skills, and quiet, generous spirit. Helen first studied for her BA from the Open University in the United Kingdom. This led to formal training in London, which qualified her to become a Jungian analyst. Helen practiced mainly here in Adelaide and recently in the Barossa, having also gained a Master of Arts degree from Winchester University. She likes to describe herself now as a semi-retired octogenarian, and I was going to use the word great-grandmother, but I don't mean great-great-grandmother. Her topic tonight is the significance of the interior life and its relationship to personal, religious and global concerns. Thank you, Helen. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for your welcome, and I hope you're not too disappointed. So what is this inner life that we're talking about tonight? What are we talking about? The lens we will be using comes primarily from the depth psychologist C.G. Jung, who was a contemporary of Freud, the two psychiatrists pioneering exploration of the unconscious mind in the early 20th century. Ultimately, the two radically disagreed and went their separate ways. And one of the chief reasons for the split was their disagreement on the significance of religion. Whereas Freud considered religion practice to be a sign of psychological immaturity, Jung was of the opinion that the human psyche, the Greek word for soul, as in psychology, psychological, etc., had an innate religious instinct as powerful as any other instinct. Jung says the main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neuroses, but rather with the approach to the numinous. But the fact is that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy, and inasmuch as you attain the numinous experience, you are released from the curse of pathology. And that of all his clients in the second half of life, their freedom came from discovering a new religious attitude to life. It is no real surprise, therefore, that the great mystics of our time cross paths with depth psychologists because of the interface that they share. Both delve into the inner person rather than remaining on the surface with the outer person. Karl Rahner said, in the days ahead, you will either be a mystic, that is, one who has experienced God for real, or nothing at all. And Matthew Fox, in his book, The Cosmic Christ, says, the mystic lies deep in every person. That blew me away when I read that. The mystic lies deep in every person. And further, he said, to deny the mystic in us is to invite the emergence of pseudo-mysticisms, including nationalism, militarism, fascism, consumerism, fundamentalism, and so on. I would similarly say that my work is concerned with vocation, that there is an urgency experienced about a person needing to follow their calling. There is an aptness in our present context to one of the reportedly secret sayings of Jesus in the Gospel according to Thomas, which is, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Jung said, too few people have experienced the divine images as the innermost possession of their own souls. Christ only meets them from without, never from within the soul. So long as a religion is only faith and outward form, and the religious function is not the experience in our own souls, nothing of importance has happened, he said. It has yet to be understood that the great mystery is not only an actuality, but is first and foremost rooted in the human psyche. His concern has been likened to that of a doctor whose patient, about whom he deeply cares, Christianity. Yes, Christianity. He wrote, I'm not addressing myself to the happy possessors of faith, to those many people but to those many people for whom the light has gone out, the mystery has faded, and God is dead. That is why I take these thought forms that have become historically fixed, try to melt them down again and pour them into moulds of immediate experience. So experience, rather than dogma, is the requirement of our age, I think. If you will bear with me, I will try to weave experiences of my own life around what I have to say. I probably also have to ask for your patience because recovery from a minor stroke I had in April this year might slow down my speaking and getting words out. So, my first experience took place at Whyalla. So I was 5 years old when we left there. So what I'm describing must have been around that time. I had attended church, like I always did with my parents, and heard the reading of Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you're there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there shall your hand lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. And I can remember thinking, is there really nowhere I can go without God being present? I'll try it out. So when I got home, I emptied out a great big toy box and thought that if I got inside it and let the lid down, I would see. And so I did. And God was present. That same box is a present stored in our shed, and it's not really so big. These days, I might express that of, whither shall I go? There is nowhere. These days, I might express that in terms of the words that were over the doorway of Jung's house, which were, invited or uninvited, God will be present. Let's look now at what we might call Jung's map of the psyche. First, there are the archetypes. An archetype is the name given by Jung to the deepest part of the psyche, the inherited parts that are seen in everyone, around universal experiences of all of us, such as those related to birth, death, marriage, numerous, countless ones, orphan, king, fool, mother, father, separation, etc. These typical patterns of potential psychological energy are common to all human beings, but are at the same time moulded by differences in cultural contexts. But archetypal theory is seminal to Jungian thought. concept of the level at which we make connection with spiritual reality. In Jung's terms, the centre of the whole psyche, embracing what is both conscious and unconscious, is the capital S self. At the opposite end of the psyche spectrum, the most superficial, skin-deep level of the psyche is the persona, which is a word meaning mask. So it is the part of the psyche which is turned towards the outside world, to what behaviour appears. How do I look? How am I coming over? Those kinds of things. In dreams, often the persona is recognised as clothing, something you take off or you put on, depending on the circumstances. And in between those two levels, the ego, the I, which is the centre of consciousness, and it is the self we take ourselves to be, me, I. The conscious ego has its own agenda and image of itself, which is frequently in opposition and resistant to the unconscious as yet material which seeks to become conscious. The false ego self is characterised by separateness from our real self. We look for false addictive ways to fill our emptiness. It is who we think we are. But thinking does not make it so. Our identity created through our culture, these are the sort of things that make us think we're who we are. Our culture, our education, our class, our race, our gender, our clothes, money. It seems we have to create this ego first, though, to get started, before we find its limitations. So we are experimenting and learning to adapt and things like that. In Jung's view, the psychological experience of the self is indistinguishable from the experience of God. And Jung was at pains to make clear that his interest lay in articulating the religious experience, and that he did not profess to make metaphysical or theological statements. Now, get back to the map. Shadow is the term for what remains unconscious or unlived in the psyche. It is often, as I've said, opposite from the ego ideal, that is, how the ego likes to look at itself. So whatever it is might remain in the shadow as a preferable option, because we usually don't want to become conscious of our shadow. We're not sure what it might come up with. Yes, it's not unusual for the unconscious to be feared for what it might contain. However, Jung says that the shadow, if it is engaged with and integrated into consciousness, usually proves to be 99%, no, 90, better not be I think it was, he said, pure gold. Worth the effort, in other words. One of the most important ideas Jung had was what he called individuation. Individuation can be seen as the process of maturing towards wholeness, a lifelong growth in consciousness, comparable to spiritual development. In fact, he saw individuation as a profoundly religious phenomenon, akin to consciously seeking the will of God for one's life. The major thrust of individuation is the gradual shifting of the centre of gravity of the psyche from the ego to the self, capital S self. The ego increasingly serving the self. Even though, as Jung said, the growth of the self is inevitably felt as a blow to the ego. It is the self which initiates the process of individuation, and realisation of the self is the goal. In some cases, what is conscious and what is unconscious have deviated so far from each other that neurosis does develop and psychotherapy is sought. Self is a union of opposites, conscious and unconscious. When it first emerges into consciousness, the opposites split apart, and the ego is faced with the conflict of their opposition. I recall an example from my own life of struggling with increasing awareness of this split, opposites being present, and I knew they were both there, and seemingly nothing to bring them together. At this time, I recall visiting the centre of Australia, a place that you might know called Simpson's Gap. As I turned a corner, I was shocked to be confronted by a view of the landscape which spoke directly, though completely unexpectedly, to the impasse I'd been experiencing. Straight ahead of me was an enormous rock split from top to bottom. People were walking through this split in the rock along a riverbed which was dry. Underneath, I knew the river was running, hidden underground. And in the gap, a large tree was growing, its branches spreading out in front of both sides of the rock. Its roots, although invisible, would be doing likewise at a great depth, matching the height of the tree. When I saw the tree being nourished by the invisible water on both sides of the split, I knew there was hope of my split consciousness being healed. I remember in the early days of my own analysis realising that Jung had provided a different language for the same religious phenomena, but one that made better sense to me. Now, this is true confessions. I'd often wondered, what is so good about the good news? I'm still so grateful to you for opening new doors. Another thing that I realised, and I'll come to more of this later, was that of realising that my dreams knew me better than I knew myself. Individuation asks the most fateful question: how are you fulfilling your life's task? The meaning and purpose of your existence? What are you here for? Religion has, of course, been asking such questions for all time in relation to fulfilling the will of God. Individuation is a lifelong process. In the first half, expansion of the personality and adaptation to the outer world is the task which is handled by the ego. The second half is characterised by a renegotiation of the ego-based certainties of the first half and adaptation to the inner life. In the words of Schopenhauer, the first 40 years of life furnish the text, while the remaining years supply the commentary. And concerning numbers, the scriptural account of the man healed by Jesus at the pool of Bethesda after spending 38 years of his life paralysed on a stretcher could be regarded as a call to individuate. My experience as a therapist has demonstrated how very often around this age somewhere people come to seek help. And I'm about to tell you of an experience of my own at the age of 38 years, arising from what I now regard as an archetypal story of a call to individuation. I was participating in a group of, first time ever, being of guided contemplation of the story of Bethesda by a Catholic priest. And I had the experience of being unexpectedly riveted by Christ's question to the man, "Do you want to be healed?" And of his later words, which I experienced as an almost nonchalant, "Be healed then." But between those two sayings, I suffered an urgent reviewing of my life, accompanied by a pounding heart, as though the question had been addressed to me. Perhaps this could be interpreted as an encounter between the ego and the self, and facing that necessity of becoming conscious of what I needed to take responsibility for in my own life. When something within the psyche is unconscious, as though paralysed, confined to a stretcher, out of life, the person suffers. Something else, a new attitude, an unlived yet waiting, wanting, needing to be lived out. The afternoon of human life must also have a significance of its own and cannot be merely a pitiful appendage to life's morning. In fact, some things that are true, they are true in the first half of life, may become a lie in the second, as you would say. The repressions of the first half of life, which served ego development, now can no longer be maintained. What was bypassed in earlier years demands now to be experienced and realised. Unconscious contents can no longer be dealt with through being projected on other people, or they are this or they are that. They must be confronted by the individual. So collective morality will no longer suffice. And dreams very often give imagery to whatever these demands might be. Dreams have been described as God's forgotten language. And I have found in my practice that dreams play a vital part in the work of therapy. That was when I realised that my dreams know me better than I know myself. Jung said the dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. In other words, the dream provides a portal, a means of accessing the hidden resources, the hidden sources of the psyche. As is well known, humankind across all cultures has been dreaming since consciousness began. Thomas Berry said, "Dream experiences are so universal and so important in the psychic life of the individual and of the community that techniques of dreaming are taught in some societies." The Australian Aboriginal name of the dreaming, describing the ancient cultural heritage of dreams, which have come to the elders of different peoples at different crucial times of their history, we have probably all heard about. We've heard the name anyway, the dreaming. And these dreams have been heeded with utmost seriousness and their guidance acted upon. A few days ago, I and Jonathan and Janine watched a film at the film festival which moved me deeply, called Luku Nagara. Seen through the eyes of one of Australia's most respected Indigenous elders, 77 years old, and he was actually there and was speaking with us in the Q&A. Traditional lawman and minister of the Uniting Church. And the film was set mainly in the remote community of Elko Island and Arnhem Land. But what affected me most was realising that the people are still waiting to be really listened to recognise the true value and importance of traditional Aboriginal law for the well-being of remote communities. That really upset the apple cart for me, and I thought, oh, I'll have to change what I'm talking about. But I highly recommend the film, and the next filming is at Seminary this Sunday at 2 p.m. Seminary Odeon start, so I highly recommend that. Anyway, in religious tradition as well, dreams have played a significant role. For example, in the biblical story of Joseph, the youngest of 11 brothers and the favourite son of Jacob. Joseph, after being sold as a slave by his brothers, found himself eventually in the Pharaoh's household in Egypt, where one of his roles was to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh. A particular dream was there were 7 thin cows and 7 fat cows. The thin cows ate the fat cows. Joseph's interpretation was that Egypt would enjoy 7 years of plenty, where things would prosper, followed by 7 drought-stricken years. He used this insight to inform the advice he gave to the Pharaoh that preparation needed to be taken during the 7 years of plenty to put by stores to see the Egyptians over the next 7 lean years which would follow. His advice was taken, and with good planning, the people were able to survive the drought. And from the New Testament, another Joseph, the husband of Mary, yes, and the dream was to Joseph to get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Stay until further notice. Herod is on the hunt for this child and wants to kill him. Many ordinary people would testify to having been warned in a dream somehow that something was needing to come to consciousness that wasn't there. Anyway, fortunately, Joseph did take notice. He took it seriously and took his family out of the country. And so the boy, Jesus, was saved. And the significance for Western culture of that particular dream being heeded, or not, is immense. Artists and scientists also have found that new ideas and images are revealed in their dreams. For example, the oft-quoted dream which the Belgian scientist Kekule had when he was puzzling over the structure of the benzene molecule. Scientists knew its formula but did not know how it held together. Kekule had a dream of a snake seizing its own tail. actually a common symbol in many ancient cultures, known as the Ouroboros, an emblem of wholeness or infinity. In this case, when Kukuli woke from his dream, he knew that the structure he was seeking was the 6 carbon atoms in a ring. It is now known as the benzene ring. Now these are examples of big dreams which have wide ramifications for societies, and impressive as they are, it is the same amazing process at work in the gems that are presented to us by our dreams, to us ordinary people in our ordinary lives. I have experienced it repeatedly in my own life and repeatedly in the dreams of the people with whom I work as a therapist. It appears that frequently the intention of the dream is addressing one-sidedness, making sure that what is hidden in the unconscious is a way of making itself known or entering into the conscious realm of the dreamer. Some dreams compensate for an incomplete conscious view and provide a balancing correction to it, so that attention is drawn to what the psyche is needing compensating for. Complementary dreams add missing pieces, widening our conscious view, providing the other side of a question, drawing attention to a blind spot, maybe. And such things might be blind to us, even if the rest of the world can see them very easily, I might add. And if dreams can wake us up to something, nightmares shake us awake. Dreams utilise imagery and symbolism, and the feeling present in the dream is also important, very important. It is though a dream scenario is invented to evoke a very particular feeling to which the dream is wanting to focus attention. So we've all felt that. What kind of feeling is this? Does it remind me of something? It could be something welcome, or it could be the last thing we want to be taken through or to feel again. But following the feeling provides the way to track down the clues that the dream is offering. Perhaps to return to something unresolved, which is needing to be resolved. Although it may be produced by a scenario quite different from the original happening, it nevertheless lands us in a place where we are feeling the necessary emotion. So we are moving closer to being able to do something about it, because maybe it has become conscious, or perhaps something that we can afford now to let go of. Marie-Louise von Franz, who was analysed by Jung and who spent the rest of her life developing his psychology in her own analytic process and her writings. And in her writings, she wrote, ultimately the self is the centre of the dream, the dreamer, and the interpreter of the dream. The self is. We, meaning analysts, are only the clown who watches it all. And it's true. The analyst does not control the process, but watches with the dreamer for signs from the unconscious. I must say that I trust dreams to set the agenda for work done with those who come. Joanna Macy, some of you might know, a Buddhist scholar and activist, on September the 14th, 2014, so not so long ago, awakened at 4 a.m. from a dream which left her with a simple and clear mandate: do this. And she later wrote on a scrap of paper what the dream had told her to do. The dream seemed to be saying that history is not calling for an order subject to a religious headquarters or bureaucracy, but a spiritual order dedicated to implementing authentic spiritual values in our souls and in our institutions, and linking new ones along with societal values, new ones. This is not anti-religious, but open to all those who take this on as a commitment to Mother Earth, our common home, to become part of a movement of people from varied backgrounds, beliefs or non-beliefs. And she continued to do that. I won't go into what she did, but it was to focus on what Thomas Berry has called the great work of our time, which is the survival of our planet in all its diversities, beauty and magnificence. A God image could be described as happening, which is experienced spontaneously rather than something invented or willed. The idea of God is identified with the numinosity of the unconscious. The word numinous, which was first used by Rudolf Otto to describe the experience of the holy. In Jung's words, a God image is a numinous symbol that claims for itself absolute and cosmic standing. So there's for the deity. To Jung, the God image of a tradition is not static, but evolves during time, through time. The ultimate image being embedded in the collective unconscious and moving incrementally into consciousness. So individuation works through a double movement from deconstruction to reconstruction. In the first phase, it involves deconstructing earlier identifications with, for instance, family members and traditions and cultural influences. This can lead to an absence of guiding images within the psyche for a time, and there is a period of separation from one's collective, maybe a state of alienation. It is as if the psyche needs to be emptied before it can be refilled with something new. So the very difficult time of living without a God image follows, as the person waits for the self to offer this new image yet to be integrated, something which urgently is needed to be brought to consciousness. Our religious traditions supply us with God images which could be called objective, coming from scripture, worship, doctrines, and they have not always arisen from our own experience, but they expose us to the wealth of our religious tradition. With biblical experience as a guide, revelation of a new God image comes where it is least expected. A voice speaks from a burning bush to an individual. An angel appears to a young woman. Another voice speaks in a dream. In Jungian terminology, there is a surprise gift from the archetypal world of the unconscious, the collective unconscious. The Bible could be seen as containing a progression of changing God images, which viewed psychologically, represent an evolution in the way God has been experienced and imaged. The New Testament portrays further changes of the God image. At the birth of Christianity, out of the parent religion Judaism, an expanded consciousness evolved from an originally tribal consciousness. Jung asked the pertinent question, are we to understand the imitation of Christ in the sense that we should copy his life? It is no easy matter to live a life that is modelled on Christ's, but it is unspeakably harder to live one's own life as truly as Christ lived his. I just want to say that again. Are we to understand the imitation of Christ in the sense that we should copy his life? It is no easy matter to live a life that is modelled on Christ, but it is unspeakably harder to live one's own life as truly as Christ lived his and did what was required of him. In the absence of living symbols, there is an increased restlessness and questing. Modern women, men in search of a soul. We are doubtless in one of those periods of change in history, and traditional patterns of religious life and belief have been eroded by the powerful cultural movements of the West, such as the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, modernity, postmodernism. And although it is experienced as a dryness, this is fertile ground for the springing up of new God images. The unconscious has not really been exhausted of energy and content, but awaits the conditions for its development into consciousness. Awaits. As further aspects of the self, the real self, emerge and expand consciousness, the God image changes to include them. In Stein's view, another reason God images change is that over time they tend to lose their luminosity. Initially, they have a great symbolic power and energy and are able to attract and persuade. They are also able to bring the ego into contact with the mystery which is beyond it. As it is rationalised and turned into theology and dogma, it loses its ability to link the ego to the unconscious. When that happens, the link with the unconscious dries up, and the person is left with an unsatisfied hunger for mystery, for numinosity, for the unconscious. God images must change, says Stein, in order to capture a more complete expression of the emergent self. And this is likely to happen at times of cultural and social transformation, such as our own. Human beings are now much more than fallen creatures needing to be restored, as in the idea of original sin. They are creative creatures endowed by God with a fundamental significance in the total scheme of things. In the 70s, we experienced the church divided between biblical theology and secular theology. And Brian and I came across a book written by Roger Schutz, the then prior of the Taizé Ecumenical Community in France. We were both transfixed by it. To cut a long story short, we sold a block of land and found our way to Taizé, along with our two kids, aged 2 and 4. And that changed our lives. From the moment of stepping into the Church of the Reconciliation in Taizé, built by German young people after the Second World War, hence reconciliation with the rest of Europe. And in the company of hundreds of young people experiencing the silent prayer, which seemed to last a very long time, it felt like being ushered into the very presence of God and left there. It felt like coming home, and yet I didn't realise I'd been away from home. Part of what we experienced there was the huge stretching challenge of these brothers choosing to live a common life, sharing everything and thriving on it, enjoying it, and that the separation between secular and conservative Christianity seemed to have dissolved. still find the Taizé style of prayer meaningful. Brian and I have a chapel which was a cellar underneath our house, and we still celebrate the Eucharist there with Taizé style prayer at 7 p.m. on Sundays. We are joined by others, sometimes in person and sometimes and also by Zoom. And anybody is welcome if you're interested, anybody. Although appreciative of Jung and depth psychology, David Tacey, whom some of you might know, an academic from La Trobe University in Melbourne, says religion has its own resources: mysticism, contemplation, meditation, and the tradition of spiritual discernment. He acknowledges, however, that these religious resources have been overlaid by centuries of extrinsic or external religion, and so have to be uncovered, reclaimed, and made relevant to a new social climate. This would address our present seeming collective refusal to look at climate change, at world hunger, the growing gap between wealth and poverty, and our suicidal relationship with armaments of all shapes and sizes. A further delusion casts these issues that I've just mentioned as political rather than religious. Do we prefer to keep our religious life and our hands sanitised? Paradoxically, we have greater access to information and knowledge of the outer physical world than ever before. Yet knowledge of the invisible world, so essential to consciousness, lags dangerously behind. If science comes up with something which throws doubt on something in our tradition, don't we need to update our consciousness, be ready for a new stage of evolution? I think we have to wake up, not refuse the new information which maybe doesn't fit with the old way of looking at things. I'm nearly finished. That the purpose of human life is the creation of consciousness is the cornerstone of the emerging myth that Jung envisaged. The goal of Jungian depth psychology could be summarised as the promotion of human consciousness in general and religious consciousness in particular. The human psyche is the mediator of the mysterious relationship between matter and spirit. Jung and others also see theology as the second level reflection on the data of this original spiritual experience. Historically, religious experience has been the basis of Scripture, in the sense that all creeds, dogmas, and ritual were initially religious experience. The experience comes first, then the theology. Jung concludes living spirit grows and even outgrows its earlier forms of expression. This living spirit is eternally renewed and pursues its goal in manifold and inconceivable ways throughout the history of humankind. And Murray Stein continues, this happens to individuals and it happens to collectives. Cultures are also called upon to shed their old skin from time to time and enter into a period of transformation to something new. It's a death and rebirth process. All of humanity stands precisely in this position today. Humans as a whole must change their attitude towards nature and the planet, and this provokes sharp and sometimes violent conflict between those who wish desperately to cling to past social, national and cultural identities, and what is the newly emerging paradigm. A global community is emerging, and this provokes conflict and confusion. Going on in the old way is blocked. The new is emerging, but it is not yet clear how the new attitude will ever come into being or what it will be. The evolution of consciousness has exceeded the slow pace of religious inquiry and religious development. The latter, hampered by God images appropriate for an earlier stage, but predictably with a limited lifespan. This is the end. Jung said, only a thing that changes and evolves is alive, but static things mean spiritual death. Even revealed truth has to evolve. We cannot afford to be satisfied with unchangeable traditions. The God image perceived as supernatural being who intervenes here, not there, who casts his light and favour here, but not there, on me and mine, but not on those and them. At the core of that monotheism is religious tribalism, the attitude that one's immediate group is superior to all others and must be preserved at all costs. This is the final paragraph. A psychological perspective on God and religion presented here tonight hopefully honours the divine or sacred within the depths of life, within rather than beyond it. And so it expands the religious beyond identification with a particular religious tradition or intellectual adherence to propositional doctrines. It embraces and incorporates the ever-new discoveries of the visible world and universe by the physical sciences, thus putting an end to the religion-science conflict, and weds religion and science as necessary partners. The question is, do we have time to wake up? Thank you.
didn't ask Helen at the beginning whether or not she would be open to questions. So, having not asked that questions, I think we're going to skip questions tonight directly to Helen, having to come back here and speak from this podium. But we are having supper, and I'm sure Helen won't mind responding to any of you who might have a question that you might have. I kind of feel like we need to go away from here and ask ourselves, where were we touched by this? Or even share with each other, where were we touched by what Helen had to say? It just hung together so well. I'm one of these believers that any of the great thinkers, if you can't sort of summarise what they're essentially about, almost in the way that Helen did relative to Jung, then there's something wrong. I kind of thought I feel like I want to be a bit more Jungian than I've been tonight, because of the way you not only were able to kind of give us a kind of a clarity about Jung's teaching, but also how you expanded on that, and particularly the way you finished with us and this challenge to, like, you know, if the change doesn't happen, we're dead. And of course, it is a bit of a question of time. There is a kind of imperative that's on us, that I think perhaps is an imperative that's been for the whole series for the year. What is the relationship between faith and the realities of this world? What is the reality to be faith, not just with the thinkers, but with all the horrific things that are happening on the one hand, but also the great advances that are happening on the other. And so I think we've had a most suitable finale to our year's series. And Helen, I think we'd like to thank you and show appreciation in a normal way. Now, I forgot to welcome those who are live streaming. I know two of them who are live streaming, and we're so glad that I hope that you also would have appreciated tonight. And of course, this will be recorded, won't it be, Fergus? And usually the recording goes up as a podcast almost within the week.
It'll sit on the Effective Living Centre Facebook site for completely free access, public access, for 30 days. Okay. And in the meantime, by next week, it'll be on the Effective Living Centre YouTube channel.
Right.
And it's not the case that it will be recorded. It has been recorded. It is being recorded as you speak.
As we speak, and we can go away from here and see it on Facebook. And of course, I mean, you can access it by going to the Effective Living website and then find out where the podcasts are over there. Now, David McCurdy was waving a piece of paper at me at the back there, reminding us that, you know, we're having this coming Thursday here at 1:30 an opportunity to plan for next year. There's a small group of us who are doing this, but if any of you would like to come and share ideas and help us think through what are we going to do for 2023, you're invited to come next Thursday. But if you can't come, there's a piece of paper at the back, you might have already got one, where if you've got an ideas about what is a topic, what is a theme you think that we could continue to explore with this humble creation called Seminary Third Age, then please make sure you write it down on the paper and leave it on the front desk. Now, is there anything else I should say before we finish? If not, thank you for coming, and enjoy a coffee and a tea and a nibble and a biscuit. Thank you. And thanks again, Helen.